Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we are going back in time.
Oh, cool.
To a really fascinating period of history. It's one that often gets kind of misunderstood. It's those years in between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Charlemagne. We're talking like 450 to 800 AD.
Okay, yeah.
And it's often called the Dark Ages.
Right.
But we are going to see that this era was anything but dark.
Oh, interesting.
It was actually a time of just incredible change and cultural blending, and, new powers were emerging.
Yeah, it's a period that often gets kind of overshadowed. You got the grandeur of Rome before it and then the medieval world after.
Yeah.
So it's easy to forget about. But when you look closely, there's just so much going on, so much innovation, adaptation, and these surprising connections.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we are going to focus specifically on the military organization, equipment, and culture of the post-Roman kingdoms that arose in Gaul and Britain. And our primary source for this journey is going to be the book Post-Roman Kingdoms, Dark Ages, Gaul and Britain, AD 450, 800.
I love that book.
It's really cool. It's packed with detail, and it just brings this era to life.
And it does a good job of challenging some of those misconceptions.
Sure.
For example, it wasn't just barbarians wiping out Roman civilization. It's more complex than that.
It's easy to fall into that trap,
Wow.
like Rome versus barbarians, one big clash.
Right. But what we actually see is a much more gradual process of change with all these different groups, Gallo-Romans, Britons, Franks, Visigoths, Saxons, all competing, working together, fighting. It's very dynamic.
It's a melting pot of cultures and ambition.
Exactly.
And the book introduces this concept of the sub-Roman period.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us more about what that means?
Yeah, so the sub-Roman period, that refers to the period just after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. And what's fascinating is that even though Rome has officially fallen, Roman law and institutions and even material culture stuck around, especially in Gaul and Britain.
So it's not like Rome just disappeared overnight. There was a cultural afterlife.
Yeah, like a ghost,
Yeah.
a Roman ghost.
Yeah, and the book highlights some of the key players, especially in Gaul. You have the patrici. There were these Roman-appointed military leaders. What were they doing?
Yeah, they were trying to hold on to Roman ways, keep order.
Okay.
Like Aetius, Aegidius, and even Syagrius, the last Roman commander in Gaul, held out against the Franks for years.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it was a changing world, but they were desperately clinging to the old ways.
Wow. And what about Britain? Who are the big names there?
Britain's even more fragmented.
Okay.
You have powerful warlords like Ambrosius, and of course there's Arthur.
King Arthur.
Yeah.
He's always
a big one.
Yeah.
Shrouded in myth and legend. But the book does explore the idea that he might have been a real figure.
Yeah.
Perhaps a Roman appointed military leader trying to rally the Britons against the Saxons.
So we have these figures trying to fill a power vacuum, but how did they actually organize their armies? Did they follow the Roman model or something new?
Yeah, that's a great question. The book really dives into this. And actually, what we see is this blend of Roman and non-Roman.
Like a fusion.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in Gaul, the patrici, their armies, they're still using Roman titles like Magister Militum, Comes, and Ducus.
Right.
And they had bucellary, personal retinues of barbarian warriors loyal to a specific commander.
So even though they're clinging to Roman ways, they are incorporating these barbarian warriors.
Exactly. They had to adapt, right?
Yeah.
Work with these new powers. And then over in Britain, you've got the warlord armies. They developed their own systems.
Yeah, the book mentions the Tulu, the personal warband of a British leader, and the Gosgord, a larger gathering of warriors.
Yeah, so you can see how those systems really emphasized the bonds between a lord and his warriors.
Right, that's very different than how the Roman army worked.
Yeah, much more personal.
So it's really interesting. On the one hand, you have these Roman military structures and traditions continuing, and on the other hand, these new forms of military organization are emerging.
Absolutely. And you see this reflected in their weapons and equipment too.
Okay, let's talk about that. The book has all these descriptions, illustrations of weapons and armor. It really helps you visualize these warriors.
Oh yeah, it's like you're right there in a museum.
Yeah.
And the craftsmanship is amazing. For example, the Gallo-Roman elites, they love these helmets called Spangen helms.
Okay.
Conical crests, gleaming metal bands.
Sounds intimidating.
Yeah.
And the Britons, what kind of helmets are they wearing?
Well, there's this theory that Some Britons, or maybe Saxon mercenaries working for them, might have worn this type of cap called the Pannonian cap.
Okay.
It's from the late Roman army.
Interesting.
Yeah, sort of pillbox shaped. Quite different.
So even in something as simple as a helmet, you can see these different cultural influences?
Totally.
That's cool. What about armor?
So ringmail and scale armor were still pretty common, but, craftsmanship declined. So cheaper stuff like hardened leather became more popular.
And surprisingly effective.
Yeah.
The book talks about that.
Yeah, they did some reconstructions, tested it, and you know what? Hardened leather, it works.
And then when it comes to weapons, there's spears, swords, bows, and even crossbows.
Yeah, they had a whole arsenal.
So diverse.
And each weapon tells a story about their culture, their technology, their fighting techniques.
It's really incredible what you can learn from these artifacts.
It's amazing, yeah.
It really makes you think how even centuries after Rome falls, its legacy is still so strong.
Yeah.
What other evidence is there of this Roman cultural influence?
Well, you find all these amazing archaeological finds, like late Roman armor and helmets just turning up in different places.
Right.
So that shows that they were either still using it or copying it long after the Romans were gone.
Yeah. The book describes this really well-preserved Spangenhelm helmet discovered in France. It dates back to like the 5th or 6th century.
Right.
And it's just like a prime example of how those Roman military styles continued.
And those Guslari we were talking about.
Yeah.
They actually play a key role in this whole transition.
You mean like the Bucellari?
Yeah.
Those barbarian warriors who were often employed by Roman commanders?
Yeah.
They actually helped spread Roman military practices.
Yep. They were like these cultural bridges bringing Roman military know-how to these new powers.
That's so interesting.
So Roman culture isn't just erased, right? It's being absorbed and adapted. And you see this blending even beyond the battlefield.
Yeah. The book mentions how Roman-style clothes and accessories, they were still in fashion.
Oh, yeah.
With the elites.
Totally.
We talked about the Phrygian cap, but they were still wearing long tunics, cloaks, even Roman-style shoes.
And of course, you can't forget about Christianity.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholic Church was already well established in Gaul and Britain. That provided stability in all that upheaval.
Right. The book highlights St. Patrick in Ireland and St. Germanus of Auxerre in Britain. And they helped spread Christianity and maintain those connections to the broader Christian world.
And it's important to remember that the church wasn't just a religious institution.
Right.
They were preserving literacy, education, and Roman legal traditions.
So they were like this link between the Roman past and the new medieval world.
Exactly.
So while everything is falling apart politically, the church is kind of holding things together.
Yes, it was a unifying force, this shared cultural and spiritual framework that transcended the political divisions.
Okay, so even with this Roman influence, these new kingdoms were developing their own cultures and identities. They weren't just like mini Romes.
Right.
So what were some of the key differences between these post-Roman kingdoms and the Roman world?
Well, for one thing, the scale of political organization was much smaller. Instead of this huge empire, you have these smaller regional kingdoms, each with their own ruling families.
Okay.
And instead of these big Roman cities, these kingdoms were based around smaller fortified centers. Exactly. Like hill forts or even old Roman towns.
And there was a real shift away from that Roman idea of big city life to a more rural way of living.
Yeah, and that was partly because trade declined.
Right.
Big cities just weren't sustainable anymore.
I wonder how that change impacted daily life.
Oh, definitely. I mean, this trend towards smaller local communities, that impacted the way they organized their militaries too.
Like those Tulu war bands we talked about.
Exactly. That's post-Roman warfare. It's all about personal loyalty, kinship ties.
Very different from the impersonal Roman army, where soldiers could be from anywhere and didn't even know your commanders.
Yeah, it's a big shift.
So it was less about following laws and more about personal relationships and reputation.
Exactly. A more fluid, dynamic system.
And that shift really changes the role of the warrior too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In Rome, the army was like its own thing, separate from society.
Right.
But in these new kingdoms, the line between warrior and civilian, it's blurred.
The book mentions how everyone, even farmers, were expected to fight.
Yes. Everyone was a potential warrior. It wasn't just a job, it was part of life.
And that had a huge impact on their culture, right?
Everything. Social structures, art, everything.
So even though they drew inspiration from Rome, they were creating new ways of life.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a time of continuity and change. The old world is disappearing and the medieval world is being born.
Right, and we can't forget the military details. The book goes into all these specifics about the weapons and armor.
Oh, it's amazing. And you see so many different influences. It wasn't just Roman versus barbarian. There was a lot of cultural exchange going on.
So many influences coming together. Roman, Celtic, Germanic. There were even hints of Byzantine influence.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give some examples of the weapons and armor they used?
Yeah, for sure. The book mentions the winged spear, like a javelin, that the Gallo-Roman elites used, both for hunting and warfare. They were often really beautifully made with intricate metalwork.
So it wasn't all crude and barbaric?
No, not at all. And even centuries after the Western Roman Empire fell, they still had connections to the Eastern Roman, the Byzantine world.
Oh, right.
And you can see that in some of the weapons and armor they found.
Like that Spangen helmet recovered from the River Saône in France.
Yeah.
It's thought to be Byzantine, right?
Yeah, it suggests trade and cultural exchange were happening over long distances.
That's amazing. And then in Britain, you have this blend of Roman, Celtic, and even early Anglo-Saxon influences.
Right, and the Welsh poetry has all these different words for spears, which shows how vital they were.
Oh, wow.
And those long spathis swords that the Romans used, the Britons were still using them too.
They were.
Yeah.
The book also mentions the discovery of skeletons with sword cuts.
Yeah.
A reminder of how violent it really was.
It's true. This wasn't just about romantic legends. These kingdoms were fighting to survive, for power.
It's easy to forget about the human cost.
Right, exactly. Behind the military stuff, real people were living their lives in this world that was constantly changing. And the book actually gives us some glimpses into what that daily life was like.
Right, like the Tulu system in Britain, with its emphasis on family and loyalty, how did that impact daily life?
Well, the Tulu was at the center of everything.
Okay.
It was like a big extended family where the warrior elite was supported by everyone else, the bondmen who worked the land.
And horses were super important, right?
Oh, yeah. They were crucial for war, transportation, farming, even status symbols.
But the book says that the law even set the value of horses.
Right, exactly. Shows how essential they were to everything. You see this reflected in the literature and mythology of the time, too.
That's a great point. Speaking of which, we should mention the role of women in these societies. The sources usually focus on kings and warriors, but women were essential.
Absolutely. Managing households, raising children, taking on leadership roles, they were vital.
Yeah.
The historical records may not always show it, but they were keeping these societies running.
And think about the strong female figures in British mythology, like Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay.
Right.
Maybe their stories, even though they're legends, reflect the actual influence women had.
It's a good point. History is about more than just battles and kings. It's about everyday people, their lives, their struggles, and how they made their world.
So as we wrap up this look at the post-Roman world, it's interesting to think about, if Roman traditions were still so strong, were these kingdoms really post-Roman?
It makes you think, how do we define these periods in history? What we see here is that even in times of huge change, there's also continuity.
Yeah.
Roman traditions didn't just vanish. They were transformed and woven into these new societies.
And these weren't just cheap copies of Rome. They were unique, vibrant cultures in their own right.
Exactly. They were creating something new. And that challenges this idea of the Dark Ages as a time of decline. What we really see is change, adaptation, and innovation.
It shows that history is never simple. It's a complex tapestry, and it's up to us to try to understand it.
And by understanding the past, we can understand our own time better. We're going through huge changes now too, and history can give us insights.
So if you found this interesting, I encourage you to learn more about this time period. Look at the source material, see what else you can discover, and think about how it connects to our world today.
Yeah, what lessons can we learn from these cultures that had to adapt and innovate in the face of such massive change?
That's a question worth considering, and I think the answers are really relevant to us today.
I agree.
Well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us for this journey through history.